Hi everyone, I'm Bruno Recht, co-founder of Userflix, and as of now, host of the Founder Canvas, where I chat with people that inspire me, other entrepreneurs, and people who are crafting great products. I'm super happy to welcome Andy Butt, author of The Growth Equation, executive coach, and venture partner at Seedcamp, as my first guest today.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Bruno. I'm really excited to be your very first guest, and I can't wait to dive into all the amazing questions you're going to ask. So thank you.
Yeah, me too. So yeah, let's jump straight into it. So Andy, you've had quite the evolution from design pioneer to venture partner. You wrote the book CSS Mastery in 2006, started the agency Clear Left, and now you're investing in startups at Seedcamp. What would you say is the common thread throughout your journey?
That's a really, really good question to start. So I'm a designer at heart. I think design is a great way to make people's lives better. We've all had frustrating experiences. We've all interacted with technology that is confusing, that makes us feel stupid. And so I want there to be more great design in the world. That's why I started an agency, because as an individual, I could maybe work on 3 or 4 projects a year, but as an agency, I could maybe work on 10 or 20. Through my agency, Clay Left, I founded a bunch of conferences because through the conferences I run, Deconstruct, Leading Design, and UX London, hopefully I can help other people put better design in the world as well. So, maybe if 200, 300 people come to each conference, a proportion of those will be inspired to put better design in the world, make people's lives easier. And obviously, I speak at lots of conferences and events. It's all about making people's lives easier. Um, you mentioned that I do coaching. And at the moment, I have this sort of slightly weird mix of careers where I spend half of my time coaching design leaders and the other half of my time advising startup founders. And that might not seem like a kind of a natural kind of combination, but there's a really nice thing that ties it all together. Um, with my design leadership coaching, again, it's all about trying to put more design, good design into the world. And so I usually coach around a dozen or so heads, directors, or VPs of design. And all of these people are passionate individuals who have gone from being an IC, an individual contributor, to a senior, designer, to a design leader. And they feel really like me that there should be more design in the world, that design has an opportunity to make people's lives better, to deliver more value to the bottom line, all the good stuff that we know. But they feel a headwind, they feel friction. They find that when they interact with their organizations don't see design playing an important role. Maybe engineering, maybe marketing, maybe sales, but often design is relegated to the people that make things look pretty. They're not seeing design as a source of product market fit. They're not seeing design as a source of a competitive advantage. And so they have this uphill struggle. And one of the reasons they have this uphill struggle is because they are in companies that have maybe 1, 5, 10, 20 years old. They're companies that are already doing 5 million, 50 million, 200 million in revenue. And they've got to that point, up to this point, without really having to care about design. And so they are talking to executives and they're talking to founders that don't see design as part of their success story, that don't see design as having been critical to where they've got to today. And people mostly, they decide what they do in the future by looking at what worked in the past. And so, if design wasn't that, critical, in the last 3 or 4 years, why should it be that critical in the next 3 or 4? So a lot of the people I coach are really, really stuck. And I'm very good at coaching design leaders to help them, make the case for design, to lean into kind of their ability to influence, ability to communicate, to tell a better story. But the thing I realise is, well, what if rather than having to do that, all these design leaders were working with founders that already got design? And how do you make sure that those founders get design? Well, you get there at the early stages. You get there when they're two people in a room with a pitch deck and an idea and a dream. And you help introduce them to how design can validate their problems through design research. You help them to think through the fact that the first solution might not necessarily be the best solution. You get them to realise that in a world where feature parity is just around the corner, there really isn't that much of a technical moat. But the moat that you can have is a user experience moat. You can create a product that is nicer to use, that is faster to use, that is more pleasant to use And a lot of people will switch from their current frustrating product into your much better design product. Also, obviously, good designers are really great at understanding what customers want and need. And so, it helps on the route to kind of product market fit. And so my rationale is if I can create a whole generation of design of founders who appreciate design and see design as a key part of their journey, when they hire their first designer or their first head of design or their first researcher or whatever it is, they're no longer having to be convinced that this is important. They have already seen the benefit. They've already seen the value. The next generation design leaders don't have to fight for design. They can come in, have their feet at the table and just start delivering value. And so it's this weird combination of the two. But it's all, and my whole career has basically been being an advocate for design.
Yeah, that really sounds like a great combination to pretty much leverage the impact that design can have. That's pretty cool to see. Before we talk about your transition to venture capital, maybe we can talk briefly about Clear Left. So it seemed like you saw the potential that UX can have before it really became mainstream very early on in, I think it was the early 2000s. What made you think back then that UX can become so important?
Well, I wanted to start an agency around 2005. That was quite sort of in the early days of the web. And back then, most of the other agencies out there, they would just jump into Photoshop, which was the default design tool of choice, and start moving things around based on a brief. And they would make these products look really pretty, but often the products they designed this way were difficult to use. The navigation didn't make sense. Information was hidden. The interactions were difficult and frustrating. And so I started around the time reading a lot of books around usability, around HCI, human-computer interactions. And so where I was before I started my agency, I was doing site mapping and I was doing persona creation and prototyping and usability testing, all of these really amazing things. Now, at the time, there wasn't really a language being used for this. At the time, some people called it interaction design, some people called it usability engineering, but they didn't really sort of, kind of define the whole picture. And then along came this agency out of the Bay Area called Adaptive Path. And they decided to call themselves a UX design agency. And they were arguably the first UX design agency in the world, a term coined by Don Norman at his time in Apple. And I really liked what they were doing. And so I thought, well, this is a really good way of articulating all the things that I care about. And so when I founded my agency, we called ourselves a UX design agency. Later on, I discovered that we were probably the first agency in the UK that were describing themselves as UX. We have some friends that describe themselves as customer experience. We had some friends that were like research or usability or what have you. But we were probably the first people to describe ourselves as a UX agency. And again, it was because we believed that this more scientific approach, this more humanistic approach, would have better results, rather than just like making things look pretty and then hoping that people would navigate their way through. Particularly at the time, the web was a really frustrating experience. We wanted to make it super easy. And so like information architecture was a big thing, doing card sorts, helping people define the information they were looking for in the right places, was great. The first few years was a bit of a challenge because everyone was asking us, well, like, why are you taking twice as long and why are you charging us twice as much? Because when I go to a typical agency, they just make it look pretty and they ship it. And so there was always a bit of an uphill struggle in the first few years. But we did find, some brave, companies that wanted to do things better. They wanted to go to a deeper level. And at the same time, we started writing and talking about this new UX thing that was coming about. We started UX London, which was, the first UX conference in the UK, still going today. And so over the number of years, more and more people in the UK started discovering UX. We would travel over the world to Europe, to America, South by Southwest, and talk about this new thing called UX. And probably by the time 2009, 2010, it had become like the hottest new job title. I think, at the time, can't remember who it was, like Wired magazine or something said it was the most in-demand job title. So over the course of like 5 years, it had gone from being something that nobody even really heard of into quite a big deal. I think it's gone the other way now. I think we're almost kind of regressing to the mean. I think these days, a lot of designers don't do a lot of the upfront thinking. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think one of the reasons is that we're moving into this agile world where you don't do this big design up front, kind of waterfall stuff. If you're a designer, you're probably one designer embedded in a product team amongst 10 or 12 other product teams, just incrementally improving the small part of your product. And so the big thinking stuff isn't quite as necessary anymore. You're probably not doing research, because if you're lucky, you're doing it and you've got a dedicated research team. You might be not doing quite as much strategy, because some of that strategy is being done by your product team or your product managers. And actually, a lot more of us are, the first place we start and the last place we end the day is in Figma. And so actually, it's not a million miles away, I think, of where we were, where we started, except it's Figma rather than Photoshop. I think the difference, though, is that we all have now embedded in our subconscious a much better understanding of what good looks like. And so 20 years ago, when we were making everything up from scratch, you had to work quite hard to build a good interface. Whereas now, if you've been grown up on iPhone apps and mobile phones and gaming consoles, there's often an inbuilt sense of quality, which means that maybe you don't need to do all the stuff that was necessary back in the day. And so I think we've seen a move away from UX towards a more kind of interaction design or product design kind of focus, where a lot of the communication tools and kind of sort of things that we used to use and were necessary maybe aren't quite as necessary anymore. So that went off a slight tangent there, but hopefully that was interesting.
Yeah, 100%. I think really that the field has evolved quite a lot, and as you said, that the bar has changed of what good design actually looks like. If you think about like how UX looked back then and how AI is positioned today, do you see any parallels there? How that could evolve?
I mean, I don't see parallels. I mean, it's difficult to say what you mean by parallels. Like, I think that there are always technological trends that happen in our industry, and some of them are big, sort of foundation shaking trends, and some of them are kind of little blips that don't actually go anywhere. And I think, I do think that AI is a big foundation shaking trend. And I do think that back in the day while I started, you mentioned CSS mastery. I think web standards for a while was a big foundation shaking trend. And I think to an extent UX was, although UX I think had its day. And so, yeah, sure. I think that AI will have some quite broad reaching context. I think it will have broad reaching context for society. And I think it will have broad reaching challenges and opportunities, but more challenges for the design industry and the tech industry in general. Already I'm seeing a lot of engineering leaders who are leaning heavily into Cursor and other kind of tools that allow you to write code at quite a phenomenal pace. And I think very, very soon that will be an expected skill that you have, that you will actually be, you won't be coding everything by hand. You'll be or plugging in libraries. You'll have an AI helper that will be, accelerating your performance. Whether that will be a 10x improvement or whether it will be a 0.2x improvement, who knows? But I think that is just in the same way as autocomplete and spell check has become standard. I think that will start to become standards in IDEs in coding environments, and I think it will be interesting to see how much of that makes its way into design. We live in a world now of design systems. A lot of the time, the designers that are out there are not making things from scratch. They're not designing from buttons from scratch. They're not designing 0 to 1 products from scratch. They are pulling from an existing system of tools and then laying those tools out on a canvas. And at the moment, designers are the only ones that know how to use Figma. And so while Figma is the only predominantly main design tool, a product manager, an engineer, an executive will ask a designer to lay some things out. They'll pull from a series of pre-designed elements and then we'll lay them out and then hand them over to the engineer to deliver. We're not too far away from a world where the engineers can basically pull from the same component library and lay things out in some kind of UI tool And obviously engineers have a certain level of technical ability and tool management, and so they can do that. And I don't think it will be too long after that product managers will be able to do this. I think that the next range of design tools, to some extent, sadly, will not be aimed at designers. They'll be aimed at non-designers who want to create relatively high quality designs without having to hire a designer to do this. I mean, you already see this with Canva. I mean, Canva is, a design tool for marketers. It's not a design tool for designers, although some designers use it as well. But a lot of marketing teams will say, hey, we don't have to hire a designer. Let me just use these templates. Let me use these AI kind of, interfaces in order to design my social media marketing post or whatever. And so I don't think it's too big a leap to imagine that, in a few years' time, product managers will be laying out interfaces from a component kit of parts like Lego bricks, with no designer having touched the interface beyond helping design the initial kind of design system. And so I can see a world where maybe the designers you have on your team, the majority of them are just designing and managing the design system, and you have a couple of kind of designers sort of running interference. But a lot of the actual assembly happens, through other people. And this is, this could be good if you're a designer that doesn't want to do grunt work. It can be really bad because I think we've reached peak designer. I think, probably over the pandemic, 2020, 2021, 22, we saw a massive spike in demand. And then that dropped off in 23, 24, 25. We've seen massive rounds of redundancies. And I think that is an indication that we have reached the peak employment of design. And I'm not saying that we're going to have a massive catastrophic bubble burst, but I don't think that in the future, I think it's hard to see a world where we will need quite as much design as we've had in the past. And so I think there will be a slow, ramping down of the number of roles out there as older people retire, as some of the sort of more mid-career people pivot into product management, let's say, and as some of the younger people start designing through AI interfaces, and maybe you don't need quite as many staff there. So I think we are in a quite a dramatic sea change at the moment. But I think it won't happen over 2 or 3 years. I think it will be a slow 10-year process. People will still design templates or websites for small businesses, even though you can go on to, Wix or whatever and buy a template. So it hasn't killed that market, but it's definitely subdued it.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think it kind of is branded as the democratization of design, that more and more people can contribute to it. But I think the reality probably is that these roles will merge, where you might not have like dedicated UX roles or like front end roles, where like with the help of these tools, more people can actually build more parts of a product. But yeah, that will be different, very interesting to see. I think you called it somewhere that designers could become like Figma operators, where you have like all these design systems components assembled already, and it's like just using the tool but not doing so much design work anymore. But yeah, that's we will see how that turns out.
Well, I mean, actually, I think my worry is not that they might be in the future. I think that there is a whole class of designers who currently are Figma operators, who aren't involved in the strategic thinking, who aren't involved in the research, who aren't involved in shaping the product. They're sadly given a product description diagram by a product manager and told, go and build this. And when they ask, well, what's the rationale, where's the research, they're told to get back in their lane. There's this idea of being part of a feature factory. And I think a lot of companies, a lot of designers feel that they're part of a feature factory and feel like they have more skills and more capability and more insight to deliver that is not being allowed. And I think a lot of designers have, unfortunately, been relegated to being the Figma operator. And I guess my point is that once Figma is not a tool that requires expert use, but that work that was once done by a Figma operator can be done by an unskilled product manager and deliver something that's like 80 or 90% the same level of quality, there is a real concern of what all of these people will end up doing. Will they move into product management? Will they move into all these amazing high-level jobs that everyone talks about? Automation will unlock creativity, or will there be a slight hollowing out of that market. And I think at the moment, it's too early to say where things are going. And I think the reality is it's going in a bunch of different directions. I think there will be higher level design. I think there'll be I think it's kind of pinging out in a range of different areas. So yeah, it's
sure. Yeah, absolutely. Maybe we can talk a bit about your transition to venture capital. So how has moving into VC changed your perspective on design's role in early stage companies?
Well, as I've said already, I am a huge advocate for design. And I always thought that if I was running a startup, my first hire would be a designer. Because I think designers are amazing thought partners for technical or business founders. Because if you are a founder of a company that doesn't have design skills, you have a vision in your head of what you want the product to be like, but you can't physically manifest it. And if you only have engineers around you, it's manifested in an engineering way. It's manifested in code, but maybe the interactions aren't well thought through. Whereas if you can work with a great designer, they can pull the ideas out of your head. They can kind of present them to you in a realistic kind of prototype mock-up kind of way, and then say, is this how you meant it to work? And then they can go, yep, absolutely, that's how I meant it to work, or no, it's not how I meant it to work. And that can be pretty quick, because if you have to wait for days or weeks or months for someone to code it up, only to go, that's not what I meant, then you have to throw some of the code out and rebuild it. Whereas if you can do that with a sketch, with a prototype, with a in Figma, it's a really, really useful communication tool. And so I love the idea that would be the early process of design. However, when rubber meets the road, I've found that a lot of founders, the majority of founders I meet, they're maybe 6 months, 9 months into their journey, and they don't have a designer. And so I'm thinking, well, look, I'm going to look at their product, and their product's going to be awful. And actually, that's great for me, because if their product's awful, there's a lot of things I can do to help them. And I go to their product, and it's actually not too bad. And why is it not too bad? Well, it's not too bad because the engineers have pulled together quite a decent UI kit. And so, while the design might not be unique and inspired, it's pretty sophisticated. The buttons are good, the interactions are good, the grid is good, the typography is good. And that's been done by people that have got no design skills. The founder has been able to communicate to a certain level, enough to kind of, maybe get their first 20, 30, 40 customers. The product probably won't be good enough to attract really discerning users. And actually, there'll probably be a whole bunch of annoying, frustrating usability problems that are baked into the product that the founder hasn't seen. Because often, if you don't come from a user-centered perspective, you assume people will always do the right thing and follow the happy path. And a lot of the problems, I think, with these early products is, they're either designed around what's useful for the engineers, and a lot of engineers are super users. They don't assume that a lot of early users are going to find these things difficult. And so what I tend to find is that founders can actually get really, really far with no designers at all. But then they start hitting a blockage. It might be 6 months after launch, or maybe a little bit before, 3 months, or a little bit after 9 months. But whatever, they open the floodgates, or so they open the doors and expect the floodgates to come in, and expect that loads of users will start using the product, and they don't. And so they think, I'll need to add more features, and add more features, and it doesn't do anything. And they add more features, and it doesn't do anything. And eventually they start wondering, maybe the problem isn't that we don't have enough features. Maybe the problem is that the features we've got are hidden. Maybe we're not talking about the product correctly on the website. Maybe we need to get someone who can articulate our proposition better. Maybe we need to make it more attractive or easier to sign up. Maybe we need someone that can help get people through the door quicker. Do we really need a 7-step sign-up process? Maybe we can make that smoother. And then when people get there, do they know what they're going to do? Do we dump them into a kind of the middle of an empty kind of interface, or do we give them some guide rails? What can we do to make them have value quicker? Do we group everything together in a way that makes sense, or does the interface spread things out in a way that's kind of really weird and frustrating? And often when they get to that point, they think, oh, we need to hire a designer, and not just someone to make it look pretty, but we need to hire an interaction designer or a UX, a UX capable product designer. And so usually that's a mid to senior level product designer that can still do the brilliant design work, visual design work, but also has a understanding of user needs and user behavior, and can kind of like brute force their way through designing a more usable product. And so again, to answer your question, I wish there was an opportunity to have designers earlier on, but I actually think you can get quite far without them. But you do inevitably hit a roadblock where you need to get designers in because things just aren't gelling right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe as a follow-up, so I hear more and more people like Brian Chesky, for example, or guys at Y Combinator Designers Fund saying that more designers should start companies. What's your take on that?
I mean, of course. I mean, that's the other reason why I wanted to get into VC, because I wanted to encourage more designers to become founders. I think designers have a lot of really good qualities that make an excellent founder. We're product people at heart, and a big part of the success of any startup is having a really good product, a product that meets customers' needs. But also, sales and marketing is also about understanding and interpreting customers' needs. And so I think if you are user-centered, if you are an empathetic human being, and you can listen to customers, you can ask the right questions, you can problem solve, then you can sell products and you can build products. And so I think product people, designers particularly, are great at this. There are some challenges though. I think product people can be perfectionists. A lot of product people, when they start a company, they want to do the design process perfectly. And they want to do a ton of research and a ton of sketching on wireframe and prototyping. But often, very quickly, they find that they're running out of time and money and budget, because the budget is limited. And so a lot of designers sort of start realizing, oh, actually, I can't do all the things that I've always wanted to do. I need to be a little bit more efficient. And so actually, weirdly, I think having run your own business for a while can really help designers realize some of the pressures that some of their business partners are under, because there is a kind of a commercial imperative and a sense of pressure there, which often designers don't necessarily feel the need to lean into. So in a weird kind of way, I think it can make you an even better designer having had the experience of being a founder, because you gain that empathy, you get a better understanding of what your business partners are going through. I think you need to have a really good technical partner or a really good business partner. But yeah, I'd like to have lots more design founders understand what's involved and go on that journey. And I think you might mention this later, but I'm running a little course over the summer all about trying to teach designers what they need to understand in order to be a successful founder. And also, a lot of that will be fundraising and what investors look for in a product. Some of it will be team makeup. I think, making sure that you've got the right people that are joining you on this journey to maximize your chances of success. But yeah, if I can help create 5, 10, 20, 50 new design founders, that would be an amazing thing to have helped do.
Sure, yeah. So we briefly touched on AI tools already, but I'm really curious to hear how these AI development tools, so you mentioned Cursor, for example, are changing the pre-seed landscape in your opinion. So when founders now can build MVPs in weeks instead of months, for example, has that shifted how or what Seedcamp expects to see from companies at that stage?
I don't think so necessarily. I mean, I think for the last 20 years, what we've seen is an increasing level of engineering efficiency. It used to be the case 20, 30 years ago that in order to build a startup, you first needed to go and buy a server and have it installed in a telephone exchange, or not a telephone exchange, but like an internet exchange. And so it used to be really, really expensive. The cost of hardware's come down. It used to be the case that you'd have to build everything from scratch. but the existence of libraries have meant that the speed of development have come down. We've seen really, really amazing tools that kind of, your Ruby on Rails and what like, which could kind of massively speed up development speed. So I just think this is the sort of the latest incarnation of that. I think using AI can mean that you can deliver work faster. But there's an arms race, because if it was only you that could do this, then that would be great. You'd have a moat. But if everyone can do it, that means that the expectations of what you can deliver have gone up. And so in a weird kind of way, I don't think it necessarily makes things easier. It just makes the quality of the expectation of speed and delivery much higher. And so, but I do think that if you are a team at the moment, there's this whole idea of like the small Silicon Valley startup, this idea that nowadays with all the tools available, you can have a 5, 10, 20 person team and potentially build $1 billion business off of that. I mean, we all know that kind of, Instagram was pretty small when they sort of sold to Meta. And I think, we will see more and more of these companies that will build surprisingly culturally impactful products with teams that are half or quarter of the size. Now, if that happens, that is a good thing for VC, because it means that you can get a better signal of whether a product is going to succeed at an earlier stage with less money spent. And also what it means, obviously, if there's less money spent, more people can deliver more products for the same cost. So if you're a $100 million fund, at the moment, maybe you're used to writing checks of 2 million. Maybe in the future, you'll be writing checks of 500K. And that means that you can quadruple the number of checks you write. You could quadruple the number of bets, because more people can do things more with less. So yeah, I think there will be a change in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you briefly mentioned mode. What do you think can be a mode in the future when like more people can build more products or more complex products? Will it then be distribution, or how do you see it? How do you see that?
I mean, I think distribution is really, really key. Again, I talk a little bit about this in my book, and also in a lot of the other kind of conversations I have with founders. Like, you have this idea of product market fit. And a lot of the people that kind of get into the startup world come from a product background. And so it's only natural that they will lean into the product side of things and they will build the best product possible. But there's this idea of the field of dreams fallacy. If you build it, they will come. And just because you've built an amazing product doesn't mean anything if people don't discover it. If people don't find it, if people aren't encouraged to sign up and kick the tires, if people aren't discovered to change their current behavior into your new product and embed new behaviors. And so I see tons and tons of really amazingly built products that should be successful on the market, but they haven't really cracked that market side of the equation. And so I think if the cost of delivering product comes down, then your moat does become your ability to sell. And whether that's a really charming founder that's great at sales, whether it's building up a really amazing sales team early on, whether it's like really cracking, marketing and social media, which is getting harder and harder and harder. I think a lot of the companies that have done really well have done well because there's something there. Maybe the founder was already a really charismatic kind of, Twitter, kind of pundit, or was really, big in YouTube, and already had a kind of a market, an audience of people to draw upon. And so suddenly that becomes the thing that's attractive. And maybe that's a thing that more VCs will index on. At the moment in the UK, it's changing tack slightly, but it's really hard to get a fiction book published if you're a first-time author with no market, because the book publishers realise that it's much easier to get someone off telly, a comedian, a game show host. Maybe they'd even write the book. Maybe you get a ghost writer to write the book, but that person has a platform. That person has 200, thousand followers on this, 2 million followers, 5 million followers on that. And so we are seeing people being invested in, not because they are good at what they do, but because they've got a platform. I mean, this is ultimately what influencers are. Influencers are people that have captured a platform, like a chunk of users, a chunk of kind of attention, and then people are willing to give them a bunch of money in order to kind of get their products in front of the attention of the people that they're following. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we see more and more celebrity startups. I wouldn't be surprised if, you're starting to look at the person's social media profile much, much more when you're deciding to invest in a company. Because, and this is one of the weird things about VC, is every founder thinks their idea is unique. And it's the first time anybody on the planet has ever thought about that and pitched it. From a VC's perspective, we see the same patterns coming back every 6 months. And so the problem is, I look at an idea and go, well, that was really great. We didn't invest in it 6 months ago. So what is it about this team that means that we should invest in them now? And if we don't invest in them now, we can wait and another team will come along in 6 months' time. So it's not just about the product, it's around who is behind the product and what their chance of success is. And so that is a big part of the equation. Is, it's not just having a brilliant idea and having a demo. It's great. How are they going to connect this to the audience? And this is one of the things I find is often missing the most in decks is go-to-market strategy. Big part of the book is all about go-to-market strategy for that very reason. Because if you go to pitch your company and you have no idea how you're going to get anyone to care, the chances of you getting investment are much lower than someone that comes in with a really thoughtful, considered, this is how we're going to launch it, this is how we're going to get it out there, this is how we're going to get into people's hands. So I think go-to-market strategy is really important.
Yeah, for sure. So we talked a bit about your book, The Growth Equation, already, but maybe you can give us a high-level overview of the concept and how you came up with the equation, basically.
Absolutely. So I've been sort of advising startups for a while now, startup founders particularly, and I just found myself coming across the same kind of problems over and over again and having the same conversations over and over again. And I thought, well, rather than kind of waste all this time and energy, why don't I kind of jot this all down? And so I spotted sort of a pattern of 7 kind of sort of fundamental things that if there is a problem with your startup growing, there's a really, really good likelihood that it's one of those 7. And so I turned those 7 elements into the growth equation, 7 factors that have a positive or negative effect on your growth. And I won't go list them out in detail. You can go and download the first couple of chapters of the book for free, and the growth equation is there. But it's really a diagnostic lens. I find that a lot of founders, when they launch their startup, they're feeling really, really positive. They're going to take on the world. Everything's going to be amazing. And when it doesn't blow up and go sort of supersonic, they sort of fall into this sort of trough. And that trough is something that kind of, this trough of disillusionment is something that most founders struggle. It's just the natural kind of journey of high highs and then low lows. And I guess my thinking around the book is when you're in this sort of trough of disillusionment, you're stressed, you're worried, your plans of world domination are now out the window. Everything you've told your investors, everything you've told your partners or friends is starting to kind of fade away. And so your ability to think rationally often goes out the window. You start panicking and you start going, well, what if I do this? What if I do that? What if I do something else? This week you'll read a newsletter and it will talk about a growth hack, and so you'll try that and it doesn't work. Next week you'll listen to a podcast and it will tell you something else and you'll try that. People are kind of in this almost sort of panic mode where they're trying anything, hoping that something will work. And I want people to sort of take a step back, in the same way we talked about UX, rather than just going into Photoshop and making things look pretty, really start looking at the product or the business through a more scientific lens and start figuring out where the problems are. Because again, it's this whole idea of Einstein's kind of like, if I had an hour to save the world, I'd spend 55 minutes deciding what the problem is and then 5 minutes coming up with a solution. I think you need a bit of a guide, and so the book is effectively a guide, a playbook. If you find yourself in that trough, if you find yourself with stalled growth, if you're looking at your runway disappearing, you're like, what do I do? The growth equation is a lens through which to see your product. And then all of the other chapters are basically the wisdom of all of, everything I've learned about growth over the last, 25 years. You could go and read all the podcasts and also listen to all the podcasts, sign up to all the newsletters, read all the articles, but you'd spend years and years and years trying to find this information and sift through it. And so I've kind of done the hard work for you. And so a lot of the people, my founder friends that read the book are like, oh my God, Andy, like this book is amazing. I wish I had read this book when I started my founder journey, because you've managed to synthesize all the things that I learned, but I learned the hard way. And it took me 3 or 4 years to learn this stuff. And if I'd had your book as a guidebook, I would have been able to get through that journey in 6 months' time. And so again, it's like a guidebook. It's like, being, if you think of your startup journey as a foreign country or foreign city, this is a guidebook that just says, hey, look, this is how it works. This is what's going to happen. These are the areas that you might, want to visit or get stuck on or whatever it is. Here you go. You don't have to panic. And so that's really the purpose, to give people a bit of a lifeline.
Absolutely. I had the exact same feeling when I read it. I had so many highlights, and it really feels, as you said, like a shortcut to all the knowledge that you gained over the years. So it's super, super valuable. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, you wrote me a really nice email in organising this session to say that you've read it a few times, and or you'd read it and you wanted to reach out before you'd finished it because it was so valuable. I'm just kind of curious what you found helpful, because you're a founder and you're on your founding journey. So what were some of the things that you found useful in the book?
Well, there are so many things. I would say that it is so holistic. I think I wrote it in the email as well, that before reading it, I had so many questions, because there are like so many moving parts that you have to bring together in order to succeed. And it really provided me so many answers or new ways of thinking about certain disciplines. I think that was most valuable to me, not only one part, but rather the complete picture, because I would say many other books rather focus on maybe one thing. So we had product-led growth, for example, where there's a deep dive into that topic. But what I really liked about your book is the information density. So there's really no fluff. It's just like every sentence is so valuable, and that's like how the book currently looks like. I have so many highlights there. And really having like the complete picture from growth to hiring and all these different areas, I think that makes it so valuable to me.
I mean, this is great to hear. I have read so many books that were effectively 1 or 2 concepts, and they could have really been a blog post.
True.
And somebody sort of expanded it out. And I didn't want my book to be like that. And I've also seen a whole bunch of books recently that are in the growth space that look really interesting. When you get them, they're like paper thin, they're pamphlets. Mm-hmm. And you read through and you're like, there's nothing here. Like these are empty. So I information density was exactly what I wanted to do. But it's not dense in terms of, I don't think it feels like a big slog. It's still a book you can get through really quickly. It's not a big tome, but it's something you can read on a long flight or a couple of shorter flights. But I just think it's it just kind of tells you all the things that are likely to go wrong, all the things that are kind of the areas and problems and common sort of wisdom. And so I'm really glad that you found that as well.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. I think it feels very accessible, and while reading it, you really feel that you put a lot of effort into that to make that accessible, because as you said, you cover so many things, and that could feel like a lot of work. And I mean, if founders are the target audience, they're obviously busy with so many things. So really great job here. If we dive a bit deeper, you write about the feature fallacy, the belief that the next feature will suddenly make people want to use the entire product. I'm curious to hear how founders can avoid this trap and focus on what actually drives growth.
I mean, sometimes it can be. Sometimes it can be a particular feature that you unlock. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater necessarily, but as I said, like a lot of people that start a startup, are either they're product people. They're either designers, product managers, or builders. And so it's natural to think that if you have a growth problem, you will get yourself out of that problem by doing the thing that you're good at. And the thing you're good at is kind of building. And so people try and build their way out of problems. And the reality is, if the problem you have is a product problem, you can build your way out. But if the kind of problem that you have is a market problem, the market side of product market fit, then no amount of feature additions and value additions will necessarily get you out of that problem. Because a lot of the time, hopefully, if you've built something good, the value's there, but the value's hidden. And so your job isn't, features are effectively new capabilities usually you're putting into the product. You're wanting to think, well, I want it to do more, I want it to do more, I want it to do more. But actually, often, the more you put in, the harder it gets to find that value. If you've ever looked at like a Swiss Army knife, if you've got a Swiss Army knife with 3 or 4 blades, it's kind of easy to figure stuff out. Mm-hmm. If you've got a Swiss Army knife with 20 or 30 blades, you spend half the bloody time like pulling the blades out, going, oh no, that isn't the one I wanted, oh that's, And so adding more features can make the product even harder to use. And it can make it even harder to explain and talk about, because it just becomes a kind of a mass of features. And like I say, it's very rare that there's one feature that makes the growth unlocked, because in order to experience that feature, you have to be a customer already. And so a lot of the time, people are, oh, no one's signing up, I need to add a new feature. But if that feature's hidden behind a sign-up process and a payment gateway, then that's not the reason why people aren't using your product. They're not using the product because they don't understand what it is, because it's been poorly communicated, because they just don't get it. And if they do make it through your product, and the reason they're not coming back, it might be the reason not coming back is because it doesn't do the thing that you want it to do, in which case add more features. But often they just can't figure out how the product works. As I said, the onboarding flow doesn't make sense. The value isn't there. In the book I talk about like time to value, speed to value. You need to be, we think that adding features equates to value. But actually, a lot of the time, the value might already be there, and your job is to kind of expose it, and adding features will hide it. And so you just got to be really sensible. And this is why I say like the growth equation has these sort of 7 factors that allow you to really analyze what's going on there. If the value isn't there, add more value. But if the value is hidden, you need to do something else. But it's a default thinking. Again, like I say, if you're stressed, if you're tired, if you don't know what's going on, and you've got a big pipeline of features, you just keep adding more and more and more. How you break out of that, unfortunately, like either you have someone like me come along and kind of like talks you down off the cliff, mm-hmm. or you just keep adding features until you get to that realization yourself. Again, it's this whole, it might have been another Einstein quote, I don't know, but like this idea of you don't keep doing the same thing and expecting different results. You added a feature and you're absolutely certain it's going to do a thing, and it has a little bump, but then nothing. You add another one, it has a little bump, nothing. You add another one, it has a little bump, nothing. After 3 or 30 or 300 of these times, at some stage you need to take stock and go, this isn't working. Why isn't this working? Maybe I'm doing the wrong thing. Maybe I actually need to take a different tack. And so, unfortunately, you can tell people to the blue in the face that maybe their approach isn't working, but they need to feel the pain themselves. And often that pain is a looming deadline. It's running out of money. It's mm-hmm. potentially having to make people redundant. It's going into a fundraise where you don't have the traction. And what I hope the book will do, is make people realise sooner that they're on the wrong path, give them more of a manoeuvring space in order to make the changes they need so they can get back on track. It's not always wrong, but often it's this default behavior that doesn't help.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, got it. In the book, you make a strong case that even product-led companies rely heavily on sales, especially in the early days, with the hope to start that potential flywheel. And I would be interested to know, why do you think are so many founders reluctant to do sales, and how they can get over that?
I mean, again, like the book has got a whole chapter on sales, a whole chapter on marketing, a whole chapter on product-led growth, which I think, really, really worth sort of diving into. But sales is awkward. Like if I'm a product builder, like I'm probably, maybe not the most, outgoing person in the world. If I'm an engineer, if I'm a designer, I'm much more comfortable interacting with my idea or my design tool than I am, going out into the world. There's a lot of rejection. I talk about that in the book as well. Like, like if you're going and doing sales, if you're actually phoning people up or running demos, every single day someone's telling you you're not good enough, you're not worthy enough, this isn't working for me. You've got to have a pretty thick skin. And I think a lot of designers particularly, but a lot of founders in general, just don't want to put themselves in the firing line of being told that the thing they're doing isn't working, because they've bet big that it's going to work. And so there's a nervousness around kind of getting yourself into a situation where you might have to hear this stuff. And so we don't do it. It's not fun. It's not nice. And so often what we do is if rather than doing sales ourselves, we'll hire somebody to do the sales for us. But as a founder, you're the best person to do the sales. You know the problem, you know the pain you're trying to solve, you know the market. Hiring a junior SDR or a junior account executive who doesn't really care, it's not their baby, you're never going to get anywhere near the same amount of impact. And so I generally think that founders need to do their own sales for the first 6 or 9 months. They need to iterate. They need to, it's almost like a design problem, that an engineering problem, product problem. You need to iterate. You need to figure out what's not working in your sales pattern, in your outbound, in your emails, in your scripts, etc. And you need to improve and improve and improve. And once you've got your playbook working, then you can hire somebody and say, hey, look, this is a playbook. It's got 80% there. It's not perfect, but you take this and now you improve it. And that salesperson or those 2 salespeople you hire will then be much, much better at doing it because you've already kind of like charted the way. But yeah, it's awkward. And like I say, if your attitude is product, you're going to go back to the thing you're comfortable with, and that is building. Oh, well, let's look at the roadmap again. Let's, add this, add that, whatever. But it's often not the right thing to be spending your time in.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's easier, as you said, working on a product. It feels more comfortable because that's what maybe you feel more capable of. And the idea, especially in the early stage, obviously is still fragile, but it's still important to hear the market feedback, right? So if we maybe talk about the difference between founder-led sales and product-led growth. So you write it in the book as well, but is there like a clear point in time where you think you should do one versus the other, or is it like once you reach product market fit that then you can really start thinking about product-led growth, for example? How do you see that?
Yeah, well, I'm a huge fan of product-led growth, and I think in a weird kind of way, the book is a product-led growth book in stealth to some extent. There is a whole chapter on product-led growth. But really, the 4 or 5 chapters preceding this are all also about product-led growth, around how to improve onboarding, how to improve retention, how to improve activation, all that kind of stuff. And also how to kind of, use sort of behavioral psychology to create these sort of growth loops. And so a lot of it is related to that. But again, the key thing I mentioned in the book is that, for product-led growth to really work, you need to have customers using your product in order to get these flywheels going. Like a big part of product-led growth is creating kind of acquisition flywheels and creating usage flywheels. And the usage flywheel, you build things in that make people come back over and over again and embed in their behavior. And the acquisition flywheels are things that you can then get your customers to go and attract other customers. And if you have lots of customers already using the product, and those customers get more customers, you get a really good viral coefficient, you get massive growth. But if people aren't even coming through the door, if people aren't using your product, if you only got 10 or 100 or 500 customers, the gearing there isn't enough to make a difference. You need to be having thousands ideally, or tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands if it's a B2C product, before those numbers start really making sense. And so you've got to kind of like prime the pumps. You've got to go out there and you've got to get that first 100 customers. I think the first 100 or for a B2B company, or the first 1,000 for like a B2C company, it's got to be the hard, blood, sweat and tears of the founder. But as I was saying before, and this is kind of really the second half of your earlier question, is people love the idea that, product-led growth, I wouldn't have to do any marketing, I wouldn't have to do any sales, I'm a product person, I can just let this magic product-led growth thing work. But the other thing is, most people get product-led growth wrong. A lot of people have this idea that product-led growth just means I just build the best product possible and it will naturally take care of itself. But that's not product-led growth. Product-led growth isn't just making something good. It's about understanding those growth levers and loops and baking them in. And so a lot of the time, I think it's just an easy out from doing the things that you don't want to be doing, but are really, really, really important for you to do.
Yeah, it basically comes down to the field of dreams that you mentioned earlier, right? It's like you build it and then they will come and growth happens on autopilot. Yeah, 100%. Okay. So we briefly talked about your summer school for design founders already, but maybe you can tell me a bit about what your concept is and what you're hoping to do with it.
Sure. It was just a little thing I thought could be fun over summer. I have a lot of people reaching out to me on LinkedIn mostly, because they know I'm a designer and they know I'm a VC. So a lot of designers will go, "Hey Andy, like I've known your background for a while. I'm thinking of starting a startup. Can you have a look at my deck? Can we have a bit of a chat?" And I just thought, well, rather than just kind of doing this in an ad hoc way, I'll try and build a little summer school. And so the idea is, over 6 weeks over the summer, every week, probably every Friday, I do a little 2-hour class where I'll talk people through some of the challenges and the real nature of what it's like to be a design-led founder. As I mentioned before, a big part of that will be understanding fundraising. A big part of that will be understanding what a good product looks like and how an investor will judge your product. A lot of it will be hopefully getting people to kind of put pitches together and judge the pitches. But at the same time, it's also around as we touched on a little bit earlier, some of the behaviours that make designers really good founders, but also some of the blockers that get in their way. And the ideal is that I'll get 20 or so people that will come along. It's going to be a trial version, so it's going to be very loose. So I've given a massive discount. But the idea is people come along, they get demystified. Hopefully they get inspired. They go out there and they decide that they want to become a founder of their own thing. And so I've got a little URL. If you just go to andybud.com/design founder, you can apply. And if you're successful and you're interested and you get on the program, then I look forward to helping you explore your potential new career as a founder.
Sure, that sounds super interesting. So what should people who apply bring to that? So should it be an idea, or should they have like a rough prototype, or like is it very open to whoever's interested in becoming a design founder?
I mean, I think if you have all of those things, if you have an idea, if you have a prototype, that will be better because you're working on something that is tangible. And one of the things I will do is I will encourage people to come up with a pitch deck and then run them through the review kind of like pitch preparation sort of process. But if you don't have an idea, that's absolutely fine. Maybe you're really in the early stages of like just feeling like, hey, well, I'd love to be a founder. You can still come along. But I will ask you to kind of come up with a kind of an example idea, just so you can get a better understanding of how VCs see your products and how they will interrogate you in terms of like, and practice your pitch. I think it's open to any designer who is curious about the founder's journey, whether they're already dipped their toe in the water or standing on the edge of the pool, kind of thinking about wanting to jump in, but being a little bit scared because they don't know what it entails. And so again, it would be a little bit of a roadmap, demystifying people around what it actually feels like to do this.
Okay, got it. So as we mentioned in the beginning, so you're doing executive coaching as well. So for design leaders interested in coaching or founders considering Seedcamp as for their first round, what's the best way for people to connect with you and your work?
I mean, that's a really good question, because back in the day I would have said Twitter. But Twitter is a hellscape of unpleasantness at the moment. So I probably would push people either to my website, which is andybudd.com. If you go to andybudd.com, if you're interested in coaching or advisory work, my links and my contact details are there. Or you could reach out through LinkedIn. Or I guess I am on Blue Sky and Threads. But this is difficult, I think before you could funnel everybody to one platform. But now, my identity is spread across sort of 3 or 4 different platforms. But whichever one you feel most comfortable with. But the easiest one would be just andybudd.com because it tells you all about my coaching and advisory work and everything there.
Yeah, sure. We will put the link in the show notes as well. So, to wrap it up as the last question, looking ahead, what are you most excited about these days? Are there certain projects, events, whatever it might be?
I don't know. I mean, excitement is a really interesting sort of term because so 2 things. So there's this kind of this sort of ancient, supposedly sort of Chinese curse that says may you live in interesting times. And there's this quote that I have on my footer of my email, which is there are decades in which nothing happens, and there are weeks in which decades happen. And I think we are currently in one of those weeks where decades are happening. I think politically, you wake up every day and it feels like a month has happened overnight. But also I think technologically, I think we are going through a revolution that is akin to the early web revolution or akin to the early smartphone revolution. And I think it is really interesting and I think it's really exciting. But with that interest and excitement comes a level of trepidation. I think it's a rainy road and it's dark and there are leaves on the ground and we are going around the corner really, really fast. And, we are just on the edge of the grip of our tyres to know whether we can stay on the road or spin out. And when you are in that kind of mindset, a lot of founders find themselves in that kind of mindset, but I think as an industry and probably as a planet with that kind of mindset, a little bit too much gas, they're not being reactive enough and we crash the car. But if we don't do that, there is a level of excitement there about feeling that something's happening, something's new. So I think that's where I am at the moment. I'm really excited around all of the changes that are happening in the world at the moment, but also trepidatious, if that's a word. And so, I'm hesitant to say that the outcome will be entirely positive. And I think this is why a lot of people are in a really weird space at the moment because, the future is yet to be decided. We could be going to some kind of, amazing utopian Star Trek-like future, or we could be going to some awful dystopian Skynet type future, or more likely we're just going to go into a slightly similar broken version of the current reality. I mean, this is the other thing. Most people are worried that it's going to be positive or negative. And every time so far, it hasn't been either. It's been some weird, slightly kludgy, broken version of where we are at the moment. And I'm sure hope that's probably where we end up. But who knows? But yeah, it's definitely an exciting time to be alive.
For sure, yeah, it's on us to shape that future. Yeah, that's a beautiful end. Andy, thank you so much for joining me. That was really wonderful. I couldn't have asked for a better guest for my first episode. So really thank you a lot. So many great insights and take care.
My pleasure. I hope your podcast goes really well and I look forward to listening to dozens of more episodes.
Thank you.